Ethan navigated his car home after another remarkable day at 46, his business headquarters. Life seemed to have finally settled into the ideal balance he'd always envisioned. The company he had tirelessly nurtured over the years was now thriving, with profits climbing higher than ever. At home, his wife of over 15 years, Laura, was carrying their second child, a surprise addition that only strengthened the foundation of their lives. Their eldest daughter, Sophie, was set to begin her first year at a renowned college. As Ethan drove, the soothing hum of the car engine blended seamlessly with his tranquil thoughts, a rare luxury he hadn't enjoyed in years. Everything felt right. He had worked relentlessly to build this life, ensured his family's security, and now, he was finally savoring the fruits of his labor. But life has a way of shifting suddenly, without the courtesy of a warning. As he approached a curve in the road, Ethan lightly tapped the brakes to slow the car. Nothing happened. Confused, he pressed harder, only to feel the pedal go slack beneath his foot. His chest tightened as panic gripped him. The brakes had failed. With the car gaining speed on a gentle downhill slope, he clutched the steering wheel and scanned the road ahead. Traffic moved steadily, and the upcoming turn loomed dangerously close. His mind raced for solutions. He shifted the gears down to try slowing the vehicle manually. It helped marginally but wasn't enough. That's when he spotted a gravel shoulder on the side of the road and veered towards it, hands trembling as he fought to control the vehicle. The car jolted violently as it collided with an iron fence, bringing it to a halt. Ethan sat frozen in the driver's seat, the pounding of his heart drowning out all other sound. The vehicle was wrecked, but he had escaped unharmed. For a long moment, he remained there, gripping the wheel. His life had just flashed before his eyes, Laura, Sophie, and their unborn child. The thought of losing them, or them losing him, sent a chill down his spine. He shuddered and decided to get the car towed to a repair shop as soon as possible. At the shop, a grizzled mechanic with grease-streaked hands inspected the vehicle while Ethan paced anxiously nearby. Finally, the mechanic emerged, his expression grim. "Your brake lines were tampered with," he said flatly. Ethan stopped mid-step, staring in disbelief. "What do you mean, tampered with?" he demanded. "This isn't normal wear and tear," the mechanic explained, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "Somebody deliberately messed with it." Ethan felt a wave of nausea. Who would want to sabotage his car? He wrestled with the information, hoping the mechanic might be mistaken, or there was some other innocent explanation. Deciding not to dwell on it for the moment, he left the shop and headed home. When he arrived at their sprawling suburban house, Laura greeted him at the door. Her radiant smile was as warm as always, but tonight, there was something slightly off about her demeanor. She brushed a strand of hair from her face as she asked, "You're late. Everything okay?" "Car trouble," Ethan said casually, choosing not to elaborate. "It's in the shop now." Laura nodded, but her smile wavered briefly. From the living room, her sister Olivia sat on the couch, engrossed in her phone. When Ethan walked in, she glanced up and offered a half-hearted smile before returning her attention to the screen. There was something in her body language, stiff and uneasy, that caught Ethan's attention. "Maybe you should get a new car," Olivia quipped, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Or learn how to take care of the one you have." Ethan smirked faintly, refusing to engage. Olivia had always had a sharp tongue, and their relationship had been tense ever since an argument years ago. Still, her words lingered in his mind. Coupled with Laura's distracted behavior, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. That night, as he lay in bed beside Laura, the mechanic's ominous words replayed in his mind, "tampered with." Laura's odd reaction and Olivia's pointed hostility only deepened his unease. He tried to dismiss the nagging doubts, telling himself he was overthinking things. After all, Laura was carrying their child, surely her behavior could be chalked up to exhaustion. But the unease refused to dissipate. Before dawn, Ethan quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Laura. He needed answers. In the dim light of the garage, he stood before Laura's SUV, his heart racing. What if something was wrong with her car too? He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the steering wheel. He considered starting the engine but hesitated, fear constricting his chest. Instead, he opened the glove compartment, hoping to distract himself or find reassurance. Amid the usual clutter of papers and trinkets, a thick envelope caught his eye. Ethan slid it out and opened it. Inside were pristine documents for a family life insurance policy. His breath caught in his throat. The policy was newly issued, dated just 2 weeks ago, and specifically covered the family in the event of Ethan's death. His mind reeled. Laura had never mentioned anything about this policy. They had always been open about financial decisions, so why would she keep this a secret? Ethan's heart pounded as he snapped a picture of the documents and carefully placed them back. He sat there in the stillness of the garage, overwhelmed by the weight of his discovery. First, the brake failure. Now, this. The discovery of the secret insurance policy was too jarring to brush off as mere coincidence. It felt as though a sinister thread was weaving through his life, pulling him toward an ominous conclusion. But before diving into what came next, Ethan had to take a moment to ground himself. Just as he climbed out of the car, the creak of the garage door made him freeze. Turning sharply, he saw Laura standing there, her robe cinched tightly around her waist, her hair slightly mussed from sleep. Her expression was a mix of grogginess and curiosity. "Ethan," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan forced a smile, hoping it would mask the tension rippling through his body. "I was thinking about using your car today," he said lightly, keeping his tone casual. "But then it occurred to me, you might need it. Better I just call a taxi." Laura's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her expression hovering between suspicion and concern. "You're sure?" she asked, her tone hinting at something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Of course," he replied, managing to sound nonchalant. "You never know when you'll need to run an errand. I wouldn't want to leave you without a car." She hesitated for a beat, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer than usual. Finally, she nodded. "All right. Let me know if you need anything." Ethan walked past her with a warm, practiced smile, feigning ease. But inside, his thoughts were a storm of doubt. Laura's reaction, though subtle, had unsettled him further. She wasn't overtly suspicious, but something about her demeanor felt off. The taxi ride to his office was uneventful, but the sense of unease gnawed at him, making the space around him feel claustrophobic. By the time he reached his private office, his hands were trembling. He locked the door behind him, sank into his chair, and buried his face in his hands. Is this really happening? He wondered, pulling out his phone to stare at the photo of the insurance policy. The temptation to go to the police briefly crossed his mind, but he dismissed it just as quickly. He couldn't make baseless accusations, not without proof. If he was wrong, the fallout could destroy his family. Instead, he began searching online for private investigators. He needed someone reliable, discreet, and thorough. After combing through reviews and testimonials for over an hour, he settled on Lucas Bennett, a seasoned detective known for unraveling even the most convoluted cases. 2 hours later, Ethan found himself seated across from Lucas in a small, unassuming office on the outskirts of the city. The man exuded quiet confidence, his sharp eyes taking in everything with a practiced ease. "Mr. Harper," Lucas began, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Ethan hesitated, glancing around the room as though the walls might eavesdrop. Then, taking a deep breath, he recounted everything: the brake failure, the suspicious insurance policy, Laura's peculiar behavior. His voice quivered slightly as he finished. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," he admitted, "but something feels terribly wrong. I need to know what's going on." Lucas rubbed his hands together thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "Well, Ethan, It sounds like you've got a real mess on your hands. He paused, studying Ethan's face. Tell me more about your family. Ethan hesitated but eventually began to talk. He described Laura, how they'd been married for over 15 years, the life they'd built together, and how much he loved her. He spoke of Sophie, their brilliant daughter, who was about to start college, and their unexpected second child on the way. He even mentioned his business success and the deep sense of pride he took in providing for his family. Finally, he brought up Laura's sister, Olivia. When he finished, Lucas sat quietly for a moment, processing. Then he leaned forward, his expression darkening. Let me be honest with you, Ethan. On the surface, your life sounds perfect. But setups like these, he trailed off, his lips tightening. This could point to something darker. A contract killing. Ethan flinched as though struck, his stomach churning at the suggestion. Lucas raised a calming hand. Too early to say for sure, of course. But we need to consider the possibility. So I have to ask. Are there any conflicts, secrets, or past issues you might have overlooked? Ethan fidgeted in his chair, racking his brain. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. Olivia, he murmured, almost to himself. Maybe, go on, Lucas urged, leaning forward. 15 years ago, I started my business with Olivia's husband, Marcus, Ethan began, his voice low. At first, things were great. We worked well together. But after about a year, I discovered he was committing fraud, embezzling money. If I hadn't caught him, it would have ruined everything. I reported him, and he ended up in prison. 6 months later, he died there. A heart attack. Lucas's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. After that, things were tense with Olivia, Ethan continued. I felt guilty, so I helped her out financially. Tried to make sure she was okay. But she always blamed me for Marcus's death, said the stress of prison killed him. Over time, though, she seemed to forgive me. She even moved in with us occasionally to help Laura when I was busy with work. Ethan shook his head, his voice trailing off. But maybe she never really forgave me. Lucas steepled his fingers, his face grim. Now, that's an angle we can't ignore, he said. If we're looking for motives, Olivia has a big one. But here's the troubling part. What if your wife is involved? Ethan's stomach twisted painfully. Laura? No, she wouldn't, his voice faltered, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Lucas tapped his pen thoughtfully against the desk. It's a possibility we have to explore. But if your marriage is as solid as you say, what reason would she have? I don't know, Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas studied him intently before posing an uncomfortable question. Is it possible Laura has a lover? The words hit Ethan like a slap. He recoiled, shaking his head adamantly. No. She's kind. Honest. She wouldn't do that. But even as he spoke, doubt coiled around his thoughts. Could he really be so certain anymore? I don't think so, he added weakly. But I don't know. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. Then we need to rule it out, or confirm it. Here's my plan. First, I suggest you do a DNA test with Sophie. Just to be sure. Ethan's heart sank like a stone. What? Sophie is my daughter. I know she is. Maybe she is, Lucas said evenly. But maybe she isn't. We have to eliminate every possibility. Ethan clenched his fists but didn't argue. Second, Lucas continued, I recommend we wiretap your house. Discreetly, of course. No one will know. After a long, tense pause, Ethan nodded. All right. Ethan felt like his world was slipping through his fingers, piece by piece. Every revelation deepened the pit in his stomach. Lucas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a grave tone. And one more thing, Ethan, he said. For now, it might be wise to leave town. Take a business trip or come up with an excuse to be away for a while. Cases like this, they can escalate quickly. I once worked with a man whose wife had been poisoning him for months. She laced his meals and drinks, nearly killing him. By the time we uncovered the truth, he was blind and barely alive. The room seemed to grow colder with each word. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pulse pounding as beads of cold sweat formed on his forehead. Lucas's intense gaze locked onto his. This is just the beginning, Ethan. Stay alert. Be ready for anything. The next morning, Ethan woke with a renewed sense of purpose. His conversation with Lucas still haunted him, but he knew he had to proceed carefully. Every move mattered now. He needed to act natural while gathering information and avoiding suspicion. Over breakfast, he decided to test the waters. How about a family day out, he suggested, trying to sound casual as he spread jam on his toast. Maybe a water park, then dinner at a nice place. Laura glanced up, surprised. A water park? That's unlike you. Exactly, Ethan replied with a grin. It's long overdue. We've all been so busy, and it'll be good for us to spend some time together. Sophie, her attention buried in her phone, perked up. A water park sounds fun. Olivia, sitting silently at the corner of the table, raised an eyebrow. Her skeptical expression didn't escape Ethan's notice, but she said nothing. As the family headed out for their outing, the house was left empty, a perfect opportunity. Lucas and his team arrived shortly after in an unmarked van. They worked swiftly, installing wiretaps and discreet hidden cameras in key areas, the kitchen, living room, and even the master bedroom. Their efficiency left no trace behind. Meanwhile, Ethan made sure to act like his usual self at the water park. He laughed, joked, and even joined Sophie on some of the slides. Laura seemed to relax as the day went on, her earlier wariness fading. Olivia, however, remained reserved, her watchful eyes often fixed on Ethan. During dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant, Ethan carefully broached the subject of his business trip. Cutting into his steak, he said, I wanted to let you know, I've got a major project coming up at work. It's critical, and I'll need to be out of town for a couple of weeks. Laura's smile faded instantly. You're leaving again, she asked, her tone edged with irritation. Ethan, you're always busy with work. I'm pregnant, and Sophie's heading off to college soon. Don't you think we need you here? Before Ethan could respond, Olivia interjected, her voice calm but pointed. Laura, sometimes priorities are necessary. Ethan's providing for all of us. If this project is important, we should support him. Laura shot Olivia a sharp look but quickly masked it with a forced smile. You're right, she said, her tone tight. I overreacted. Ethan didn't miss the subtle exchange. Laura's reaction was restrained, but it felt like Olivia's comment carried a warning, silencing her for now. Back home that night, Ethan's nerves were frayed. He couldn't shake the fear that something was brewing beneath the surface. When Laura offered him tea, he politely declined, opting to brew his own chamomile blend. Are you all right? Laura asked, watching him closely as he stirred his tea. Ethan smiled warmly. I'm fine, he said. Just trying to make things easier for you. You shouldn't have to worry about anything right now. Laura tilted her head, studying him for a moment, then nodded and left the room. A few days later, Ethan packed a small suitcase and said his goodbyes. Hugging Sophie a little longer than usual, he felt a pang of guilt as he thought about the DNA test. Then, with a kiss on Laura's cheek, he left without looking back. His hotel room, several towns away, was modest but functional, the perfect hideout while he waited for updates from Lucas and the DNA lab. But Ethan couldn't sit idle. Taking Lucas's advice, he began reviewing their finances, scouring for anything suspicious. At first, everything seemed normal. But then he noticed a series of large withdrawals from Laura's account, all around the time the insurance policy was issued. Maybe it was for the policy, Ethan muttered to himself, trying to rationalize. But the math didn't add up. The total amount Laura had withdrawn far exceeded the cost of the policy. His stomach knotted. Where's the rest of the money going? Frustrated, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the cracked ceiling of the hotel room. To hell with it, he muttered. I'll wait for Lucas's report and the DNA results. One step at a time. The call came late that afternoon. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The DNA lab's number flashed on the screen. He hesitated before answering. Mr. Harper, the voice said. We've completed the testing. The results are conclusive. The DNA samples you provided do not match. Sophie is not your biological daughter. The words slammed into Ethan like a freight train. His vision blurred as his chest tightened, each breath a struggle. His world, the life he had built, the family he had cherished, shattered in an instant. Hands trembling, Ethan dialed Lucas's number. The phone barely rang before the detective picked up. Ethan. Lucas's voice was sharp. What's wrong? She's not mine, Ethan choked out, his voice breaking. Sophie, she's not my daughter. Lucas let out a low sigh, a mix of sympathy and grim understanding. I was afraid of that, he said quietly. Listen, Ethan. I know this is hard, but you need to stay focused. This is when people start to crack, and that's when they make mistakes. Ethan barely processed Lucas's words as the detective continued. We've been monitoring everything. Laura and Olivia are nervous, but they're being extremely cautious. The storm inside Ethan's head only grew. His carefully constructed life was unraveling, one truth at a time. Do you have anything concrete yet? Ethan asked, his voice edged with desperation. I do, Lucas replied, his tone measured. But I need more time to connect the dots. There's a bigger picture emerging here, but it's not complete yet. Meanwhile, you need to act, and fast. Act? What do you mean? Ethan's voice was hoarse, the weight of everything pressing down on him. First, you need a lawyer, Lucas said firmly. A good one. And financial consultants to protect your assets. File for divorce before Laura has the chance. If you don't, they might move first and take everything. Why the rush? Ethan asked, still trying to process the barrage of information. Lucas paused, then said gravely, 2 reasons. 1, filing first puts them on the defensive. When people panic, they make mistakes, and I'll have a better chance of gathering evidence. 2, if Laura files first, she could freeze your accounts or stake a claim on your assets. Don't give them that chance. Though overwhelmed, Ethan couldn't deny the logic. Lucas's advice was sound, even if it felt like a bitter pill to swallow. All right, he said at last, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll handle it within the next 10 days. Ethan worked relentlessly, pouring all his energy into securing his position. He hired a top-tier divorce lawyer and a team of financial consultants who specialized in asset protection. Together, they devised a strategy to shield Ethan's wealth and prepare him for what lay ahead. The first step was selling his share of the business. Ethan approached his most trusted partners, individuals who had supported him throughout his career. He sold his stake quietly, ensuring the funds were transferred into secure accounts Laura and Olivia couldn't access. Under the guidance of his consultants, he then funneled the money into a web of protected trusts and offshore accounts. The setup was a labyrinth of financial safeguards designed to make his assets untouchable. Finally, the divorce papers were drafted, signed, and ready to be served at a moment's notice. The hardest step was cutting Laura off financially. Blocking all accounts, including their joint one, felt cold and calculating, but it was necessary. When the last safeguard was in place, Ethan slumped back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. He had done everything he could to protect himself. The following morning, Ethan sat with his phone in hand, debating whether to call Laura. Since leaving for his business trip, he hadn't spoken to her directly. He knew she would notice the frozen account soon, and he braced himself for the fallout. The phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. Laura's name lit up the screen. Ethan hesitated, then reluctantly answered. "Hello. Ethan." Laura's voice was carefully neutral. "How are you? Is work going all right?" "Everything's fine," Ethan replied, keeping his tone even. "That's good," Laura said quickly, though her voice carried a nervous edge. "Listen, there's a payment due for Sophie's college deposit. And I noticed the bank account is frozen. Did you block it? Or is there an issue?" Ethan's chest tightened, but he kept his composure. Taking a steadying breath, he said, "Laura, Sophie's not my daughter. So pay for it yourself. And by the way, a courier will be delivering the divorce papers today." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "What? Ethan, what are you talking about? This doesn't make sense. Are you okay?" Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm fine," he said flatly. "And I'm sorry, but we'll talk in court. There'll be plenty to discuss then." He ended the call abruptly before Laura's voice could further worm its way into his thoughts. For a moment, the silence in the room felt deafening. Then Ethan's composure cracked. He buried his face in his hands and wept. The family he had spent over 15 years building was disintegrating before his eyes. Worse yet, he still didn't have the full picture. What other secrets were Laura and Olivia hiding? The phone buzzed again. And again. Ethan didn't look. He couldn't bear Laura's fury or pleas. But when the third call came, he saw it wasn't from her. It was Sophie. Wiping his face, Ethan answered. "Hello. Dad?" Sophie's voice was frantic. "What's going on? Mom's freaking out, and I don't understand anything. She says the accounts are blocked. I need money for my deposit. What's happening?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to sound calm. "Sophie, something has come up. Your college plans might have to wait for a little while." "What?" Sophie's voice rose, panicked. "Dad, I can't wait. This is my future. Please, just tell me what's going on." Pinching the bridge of his nose, Ethan summoned every ounce of strength. "Sophie, calm down. Your mother and I need to work through some things. I promise, if you stay patient, everything will be okay. We'll talk soon. All right?" "But," Sophie's voice cracked. "Please, Sophie," Ethan interrupted gently but firmly. "Trust me." After a long pause, Sophie replied in a small voice, "Okay, Dad." When the call ended, Ethan set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Guilt and sorrow churned inside him. No matter what happened with Laura and Olivia, Sophie was still his daughter in his heart. He had raised her, loved her, and couldn't imagine cutting her out of his life completely. But how much more could he endure before this nightmare reached its end? That night, Ethan barely slept. The whiskey burned his throat as he poured glass after glass, chasing a reprieve from the relentless ache in his chest. His sobs were raw and guttural, the kind of pain he hadn't allowed himself to feel since childhood. By dawn, the bottle was empty, and Ethan lay hollow and exhausted, staring blankly at the ceiling. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his stupor. It was Lucas. "Ethan," Lucas said briskly, "we've hit a turning point." The divorce news shook them. "It's working. We need to meet today, and bring your lawyer." Though his head pounded and his body felt drained, Ethan knew he couldn't stop now. He agreed, his voice hoarse but resolute. When Ethan arrived at the office for their meeting, his lawyer was already seated, sifting through a stack of documents with a grim expression. Moments later, Lucas entered, carrying a large briefcase. His face was set with the gravity of someone about to reveal something explosive. "All right," Lucas began, placing the briefcase on the table. "Here's what I've uncovered." He opened it and began laying out the evidence: photographs, video recordings, and transcripts of intercepted conversations. The sheer volume of material was overwhelming, and Ethan leaned forward, his breath catching as he absorbed the horrifying narrative they painted. Laura and Olivia appeared in numerous photos and videos, speaking in hushed tones, making phone calls, and meeting clandestinely. Then came the images of Laura with another man, Daniel. Their interactions were unmistakably personal. Ethan's chest tightened as he stared at one photo of Daniel stroking Laura's hair, their faces close. It was undeniable. "This is Daniel," Lucas explained, his voice steady. "Laura's lover." Ethan barely heard the words, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His lawyer muttered a curse under his breath, shaking his head at the damning evidence. "And this," Lucas said, pulling out an audio file, "is the most incriminating piece." He pressed play. The voices of Laura and Olivia filled the room, cold and calculated. Their words confirmed everything Ethan had feared, and more. Ethan's vision blurred as his chest constricted painfully. His lawyer reached out, gripping his shoulder. "Ethan," Lucas said urgently, leaning closer. "Are you okay?" Ethan tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The room spun, and his breathing grew ragged. A crushing pain gripped his chest as he slumped forward. "Call a doctor," his lawyer shouted. A doctor arrived quickly, administering an injection to stabilize Ethan. "Your heart's under too much strain," the doctor warned. "Stress like this can be dangerous. You need a full cardiac evaluation immediately." Ethan nodded weakly, trembling as he leaned back in his chair. His face was pale, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. "Ethan," Lucas said softly after a moment, his tone more measured. "I know this is a lot to process, but the evidence is overwhelming. We can take this to court, not just for the divorce, but for a criminal case. Are you ready?" Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet, determined fury. 5 days later, the courtroom was packed. Ethan sat beside his lawyer, his face calm but hollow. Across the room, Laura sat flanked by Olivia and her legal team. She looked confident, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, a subtle, calculated gesture. Laura's lawyers began their arguments, painting Ethan as a vindictive man who had plotted the divorce to freeze her out of their shared assets. They accused him of being manipulative, even unfaithful. They dismissed the DNA test as inconclusive and demanded an independent study. Their strategy was clear: prolong the proceedings, muddy the waters, and buy time. Ethan's lawyer fought back, dismantling their claims piece by piece. The courtroom became a battleground, each side relentlessly pushing their narrative. Laura's pregnancy, however, proved to be a potent weapon, and her lawyers wielded it expertly to garner sympathy. At a crucial moment, Ethan exchanged a glance with his lawyer and gave a subtle nod. It was time. Ethan's lawyer stood, his voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, we have new evidence to present. This material is not only relevant to this case, but it also suggests grounds for a criminal investigation." He handed a thick folder to the judge. "I must warn you," he added gravely, "this evidence may change the scope of these proceedings." The courtroom fell silent as the judge accepted the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. His expression darkened as he read. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," the judge announced, his voice heavy with authority. "I need time to review this material." In his chambers, the judge and 2 legal advisors pored over the folder. Each page painted a darker picture than the last. The first section contained photographic evidence: Daniel, caught on a street surveillance camera late at night, crouching near Ethan's car. The images showed him tampering with the brake system, a wrench in one hand and another unidentifiable tool in the other. His actions were deliberate, methodical, and left no doubt that this was a premeditated act. Next came transcripts of recorded conversations between Laura and Olivia, captured after the brake tampering attempt failed. The words revealed cracks in their conspiracy, Laura's mounting anxiety clashing with Olivia's cold determination. "This should have worked," Laura's voice quavered. "Maybe we shouldn't have done this. Maybe we should have just gone for a divorce." "Are you serious right now?" Olivia snapped. "If you just divorce him, Ethan will dig into everything. He'll find out about Daniel. Then where will you be? No alimony. No assets. He'll bury you in court, Laura. You'll have nothing." "But what about Daniel?" Laura asked, fear lacing her words. "If he gets caught, this could ruin everything." "Daniel's careful," Olivia replied coldly. "He knows the stakes. And don't forget, if Ethan dies, we get the insurance payout. His inheritance, his assets, everything. You, me, and Daniel will be set for life." A long pause followed, broken only by Laura's shallow breathing. "Fine," she finally said, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared, Olivia. This is dangerous." "Dangerous?" Olivia laughed humorlessly. "You'll be thanking me when it's over." The folder also contained videos of Laura and Daniel. One particularly damning clip showed Daniel tenderly stroking Laura's pregnant belly, whispering to her. Other documents revealed that Daniel was financially unstable, providing him with a clear motive to conspire with Laura against Ethan. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned from recess, his expression grim. He looked directly at Laura's legal team, his voice steady but weighted with authority. "This court has reviewed the new evidence," he said. "It is sufficient to warrant a criminal investigation. These proceedings will not only address the divorce but also explore potential charges of conspiracy and attempted homicide." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Laura's confident demeanor faltered, her hand dropping from her belly. Olivia's icy composure cracked as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ethan sat motionless, his face unreadable. But inside, a flicker of vindication burned. The truth was finally beginning to surface. The judge's expression was severe, his lips pressed into a thin line as he shuffled the documents before him. Finally, he looked up, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. "I have reviewed the materials submitted by the petitioner's counsel," he began, his tone grave. "This evidence is deeply troubling. It appears that we are dealing with not only a contentious divorce but also allegations of premeditated criminal activity, including conspiracy to commit murder." A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Laura's face drained of color, her hands trembling. Beside her, Olivia's eyes narrowed, but she kept her composure, her jaw set like stone. The judge continued, "Given the severity of these allegations and the compelling nature of the evidence, I am compelled to take immediate action. This court will notify law enforcement to conduct a full investigation. Until that investigation is complete, all discussions regarding asset division and custody arrangements are suspended." The weight of the judge's words settled over the room like a suffocating cloud. The gavel came down with a sharp, decisive thud. "This hearing is adjourned until further notice. Court officers, remain in the building to assist the police." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the gravity of the revelations sank in. For Laura, Olivia, and Daniel, the walls were closing in fast. Within days, the police launched a formal investigation, and the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Laura, Olivia, and Daniel were taken into custody. Lucas's meticulous work had left no doubt: the brake tampering, the secret insurance policy, the recorded conversations, it all painted a damning picture. For the conspirators, this was the end. They were charged with conspiracy and attempted murder. The carefully curated lives they had built crumbled under the weight of their own actions. Ethan, though vindicated, felt no joy, only the bitter taste of loss. The nightmare had exposed the kind of truths he had never imagined and destroyed relationships he had thought were unshakable. One afternoon, Ethan sat across from Laura in the sterile visiting room of the county jail. She looked worn and fragile, her once vibrant energy replaced by exhaustion and regret. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling. I don't even know where to start." Ethan's expression was cold, his arms crossed. "Then don't," he said flatly. "Just say what you need to say." Tears welled in Laura's eyes as she wiped her face, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. I loved Daniel. He was my first love, my everything. But life, it separated us. Then you came along. You were a good man, Ethan. A great provider. You were kind, stable. But you were never him. Daniel was my hero." Ethan clenched his jaw, his eyes unflinching. "So I was a placeholder. A paycheck. The man you could tolerate while plotting to kill me." Laura shook her head, breaking into sobs. "No. It wasn't supposed to go that far. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I let Olivia convince me. I was scared, Ethan. I thought you'd leave me with nothing." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, his silence cutting deeper than words. Laura sniffled, trying to compose herself. "Please, Ethan," she whispered. "Promise me you'll take care of Sophie. She's innocent in all this." Ethan's voice was distant, devoid of warmth. "I'll take care of Sophie because she's my daughter in every way that matters. But you, Laura, you're nothing to me now. You destroyed everything." Laura lowered her head, defeated. "I understand," she murmured. "And I'm sorry." Ethan's next visit was with Olivia. Unlike Laura, she showed no sign of remorse. Sitting in her cell, her chin held high, she met Ethan's gaze with unfiltered hatred. "I suppose you're here to gloat," she sneered. "No," Ethan replied evenly. "I'm here to understand." "Why, Olivia? Why do this?" Olivia laughed bitterly. "Understand? You think you're the victim here. You ruined my life, Ethan. You sent Marcus to prison, and he died because of you. He was a good man until you destroyed him." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Marcus was a fraud, Olivia. He embezzled from the business and betrayed everyone. He ruined himself." "Lies." Olivia spat. "You could have saved him, but you didn't. You cared more about your precious company than about people." Ethan sighed, his exhaustion evident. "I understand your anger, but you've twisted the truth to suit your hatred. Marcus made his choices. He betrayed me, and he betrayed you." "You're a monster, Ethan," Olivia said venomously. "I wanted to make you pay. But now you're walking free while we rot in here." Ethan rose to leave, his face devoid of emotion. "I won't pity you. You made your choices, just like Marcus." Sitting down with Sophie was the hardest. Her red, swollen eyes were filled with confusion and anger. "How could you, Dad?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Mom's in prison. Olivia's in prison. Everything's ruined." "Sophie," Ethan said softly, "you know why they tried to kill me. I didn't want this, but I couldn't ignore the truth. They're my family," she screamed. "And you destroyed us." Ethan's heart broke at her words. "Sophie, I know this is painful. But they made their own decisions. I had to protect myself." "You're lying." Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. "You could have fixed this. You could have done something. I hate you." Her words pierced Ethan like a dagger. He sat quietly, letting her vent her pain. When her sobs subsided, he spoke gently. "I'm sorry you feel that way. But I won't let you suffer because of this. I've set up an account for you, enough to cover college and your living expenses. You'll be okay, Sophie. No matter what, I want the best for you. Sophie didn't respond, her sobs filling the room. Ethan left quietly, his heart heavy. He knew she was hurting, and though her anger stung, he couldn't blame her. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. Laura, Olivia, and Daniel were convicted of conspiracy and attempted murder. Laura wept openly as the verdict was read, while Olivia remained cold and unrepentant. Daniel sat silently, his head bowed in defeat. Ethan had won, but it felt hollow. The life he had fought so hard to protect was gone, replaced by shattered memories and fractured relationships. Sophie, consumed by anger and pain, cut all contact, even refusing the money Ethan had set aside for her. Still, Ethan left the account untouched, hoping that one day she might forgive him. For now, he resolved to rebuild his life quietly, stepping away from Sophie's world but leaving the door open should she ever choose to return.